Good morning, everyone. My name is Rod Lohin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Michael Leachin Family Institute for Corporate Citizenship at the Rotman School of Management. The Leachin Institute is the research center at Rotman that focuses on the evolving relationship between business and society, and it's our pleasure to be the host of today's session. Before we begin, let me just say that although this event is taking place virtually, and we have people joining us from around the world, we wish to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Canada and Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, thank you all for tuning into this live stream. For those of you in the audience who've paid to attend this event, we will be sending you a copy of today's book, Anthro-Vision, after today's event. And for the next hour, you will be hearing from our moderator, Laura Doering, and our guest speaker, Gillian Tett. Laura is an assistant professor of strategic management at the Rotman School. As an economic sociologist, she examines how interactions and social psychological processes shape outcomes for households, in organizations, and markets. Laura is also a research fellow at the Behavioral Economics in Action at Research Center, otherwise known as BEAR, and also a fellow at the Leachin Institute and a consulting editor at the American Journal of Sociology. Gillian chairs the U.S. editorial board for the Financial Times and writes columns for the world's leading newspaper, including finance, business, and the political economy. She's been named British Journalist of the Year, Columnist of the Year, British Journalist and Business Journalist of the Year in the UK, and has won 2 Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing Awards in the US. Clearly a remarkable set of achievements. She's also the author of Saving the Sun, Fool's Gold, The Silo Effect, and most recently, and what we're going to be hearing about today, Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See Business and Life, which was just published on June 8. Gillian, congratulations on your new book, and we're excited to learn more about it today. For the next hour, Laura will lead Gillian in conversation and take questions from the audience. I encourage you to submit your questions while listening to their discussion by visiting slido.com. That's to spell that out, SLIDO, and entering the event code Anthro-Vision, all one word, or by using the link posted in the video description below. Laura and Gillian, welcome to the live stream. It's our pleasure to have you here today. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Rod. Gillian, it's wonderful to have you here with us. I'm delighted to talk about Anthro-Vision. So, you know, one of the key arguments that you make in this book is that a lot of the tools that we rely on to understand the world, be it economic forecasting, political polls, financial models, have been failing us. And they're not failing us because they're wrong or they're useless, but because they're incomplete. And that's where anthropology can come in, and that we can use anthropological tools to better understand and contextualize this information to guide us into the future. So, you know, as Rod pointed out, you are both a distinguished journalist as well as an anthropology PhD. Can you start out by telling us of how this very unique background helped you to arrive at the conclusions that you draw in Anthro-Vision?
Well, I should start by saying that I am indeed both an anthropologist by training and I work as a financial journalist. And people sometimes think that because I'm an anthropologist and because I have had this slightly unusual background, I must be anti-economics, anti-finance, anti a lot of the things that businesses rely on. And the answer is absolutely not. I celebrate and recognize the tremendous value of economic models and balance sheets and big data sets and all the tools that businesses have been using in recent years to help navigate the world. But my key point is this: The late 20th century was a time when the corporate world and the policymaking world and economics world developed many of these tools. It did so in a way that was often very effective, but all of these tools have a flaw, which is that they're only as good as the inputs, as the stuff you put into your balance sheet, your big data set, your economic model. And it matters where you draw the boundaries. And it matters whether or not you look beyond the boundaries to see the context in which, say, an economic model or balance sheet is actually operating. And if you don't do that, then you are at risk of being like someone who walks through a dark wood at night with a compass. You don't want to throw your compass away. You don't want to get rid of your economic model. But if you just walk through that wood staring down at the model, down at the compass all the time, if you only look at your economic model, you are in danger of walking into a tree or tripping over a tree root. So basically, my book is an appeal for people who are using these models and tools to raise their eyes, look up, look around the world, and look above all else at the context to get really checks and balances into how they're navigating the world. And I happen to think that anthropology is one discipline, not the only discipline, but one discipline that can actually help you do that enormously, even though until recently, most people thought anthropology was completely irrelevant to business because they thought it was basically all about being like Indiana Jones and going off and, looking at bones or weird rituals and things like that.
That's super fascinating. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about some of the experiences that you write about in the book that helped you arrive at this realization that anthropology was something that could be really relevant to the business world. Because I think you're right that often we do think about these as very separate spheres that don't necessarily overlap.
Absolutely. Well, the narrative arc of the book is my own life story, which sounds a bit narcissistic, but basically I use that to try and illustrate what I think are the three key things that anthropology can offer to any business person or financier or economist. And it's this. One of the guiding principles in anthropology is that it pays to embrace culture shock. Human beings are hardwired to run away from culture shock. We don't like being thrown into a weird, different culture. But anthropology argues that actually embracing culture shock and actually deliberately seeking it out is incredibly important because it enables you to basically start living, thinking, walking in the shoes of people who seem different from you. And different can mean somebody at the other side of on the other side of the world in a completely different culture and environment that looks very exotic and weird to you. It can also just mean someone who works in the next door department of you in a company or down the end of the street. And anthropologists believe that if you take that step of immersing yourself in a different type of world, even briefly to get a different point of view, you gain more empathy for others and you get a better sense on how the world works. But you also gain something else, which is a chance to jump out of your own skin, flip the lens and look back at yourself and see yourself as an outsider might more objectively. There's a wonderful phrase in Chinese which says, a fish can't see water. None of us can see the cultural patterns and assumptions and often structures that shape our lives unless we jump out of ourselves and look back. And in particular, that act enables you to not just look at the parts of the world you notice because they're visible or that you hear because they're noisy. It helps you to look at the parts of the world you ignore because they're either the kind of blank spots on your mental map or the stuff that falls between cracks, or they're the areas of silence that no one talks about because it's taboo or boring or dull or geeky. And anthropologists believe that social silence is absolutely key to understanding the world. You have to look at silence as much as noise. And that sounds abstract, but my life kind of has been part of that, in that I started off my career as an anthropologist. I did a PhD in anthropology. I went off to somewhere which seemed very strange and exotic to Westerners, although I should stress that exotic is in the eye of the beholder. And so actually Westerners seem strange and exotic to many other people in the world. I went off to Tajikistan. It's just north of Afghanistan. I lived there for a year up in the high mountain village, essentially studying Tajik marriage rituals and trying to see how that was a key to understanding how Islamic culture and the Soviet communist system interacted. This was still the days of the Soviet Union. I am old. And then I came back to the West, started working for the Financial Times as a journalist, looking at the City of London, looking at the economics profession, then moved to America later on, where I looked at how American tech culture, politics, economics, and business operated. So I flipped the lens, if you like, and tried to look at all this, and also at the media world as an insider outsider. And then last but not least, in the course of doing that, I tried really hard to look at social silences and what people weren't talking about. And time and again, I found that looking at the Western world as an insider outsider and focusing on social silences was a really good way to not just predict the looming financial crisis. And in fact, one of the reasons I predicted 2008 was very much because of this anthropology mindset, but also to see the looming tech clash and the backlash against Silicon Valley, to see the likelihood of Donald Trump winning the 2016 election, and to see the rise of sustainability and ESG. So in a sense, my book is an appeal for people to absorb these principles from anthropology. You don't have to be an academic anthropologist to use it, any more than you have to be an academic psychologist to use, say, the insights of Danny Kahneman in your life with Thinking Fast and Slow. But absorbing these principles can be a really powerful way to see more clearly in life.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was how you provided these examples of ways that your anthropological training had allowed you to see things that other journalists and other policymakers perhaps weren't noticing because they were shrouded in silence, or there was this tacit agreement that everyone sort of understood what was going on. And one of the examples that I found really salient was your description of Trump rallies as reminiscent of these entertainment wrestling matches, which Trump had experience in working in the entertainment industry. And can you talk a little bit about that example and how this parallels, why many elite journalists and observers missed the cultural cues that he was appealing to in his supporters that I think signaled to you and maybe a handful of other people about where that election was headed?
Absolutely. And I have to stress, by the way, I've got plenty of things wrong in my career as a journalist. And I've usually got them wrong, actually, when I have forgotten my anthropology training, to be honest. Brexit was one of those where I had basically slid very lazily into a pretty elite, cozy mindset when I looked back at the UK. I was living in America at the time, and I assumed, like many educated elite journalists and policymakers and thinkers, that the UK wouldn't vote for Brexit because it seemed to me self-evidently a bad idea. And I'd completely failed to do the 101 of anthropology, which is to recognize how we're all shaped by our own prejudices and tribal affiliations, and then to jump out of them and go and talk to others. And so I was completely wrong on Brexit. And in the aftermath of that, I then realized during the 2016 Trump campaign that I had to get out of my bubble, get out of my fishbowl, and go and listen and talk to people who are different from me with an open mind and try to see the world through other people's eyes, not my eyes, to understand what was going on. And what happened with Trump was basically a friend of mine said to me, who wasn't from an elite, educated, journalistic background, he said to me, if you want to understand Trump, stop thinking about Trump and the television program The Apprentice, which is what most elite people only know Trump from in television. You have to realize he's been actually much bigger in the minds of many Americans through wrestling, because he was very involved in promoting wrestling on television. And wrestling in America is more of a mass market sport. It's not really followed by many of the elite. And it's a very different world from anything that I had experienced. So I went along to a wrestling match, And when I did, I was hit between the eyes by several things. Firstly, it reminded me afresh of why one of the other ideas of anthropology is that we don't just think with our brains, we actually think with our bodies, if you like. And being immersed physically into someone else's lives can often give you a lot more insights. It's not the only way, but it can give you a lot more insights. Because, we actually act as groups and absorb cues and signals and signal things, often through rituals, ceremonies, symbols, visual images, sounds, things like that, which means that there's real merit to being immersed in things sometimes. And going to a gigantic immersive experience like the wrestling ring showed me, firstly, that what Trump was doing at his political rallies was borrowing lock, stock, and barrel the performative aspect of a wrestling match. It was all about whipped up anger in his political rallies. It was all about melodrama. It was all about aggression and combat and fighting. People were calling each other silly names in wrestling matches. If you want to know where the phrases like Crooked Hillary or Little Mark Rubio came from, these were directly borrowed from the wrestling ring. And by the way, I should say a big thank you to Naomi Klein, who actually inspired a lot of these thoughts initially as well. And the other thing was that in some ways, the genius of Trump's communication style was that he was connecting to a mass market who'd grown up with wrestling very effectively. They didn't see what he said through the prism of the type of political discourse that educated elites like myself saw politics. They saw it in a kind of performative aspect. And to cite the phrase of Selena Zito, the journalist, they took him seriously, but not literally, whereas elites were taking him literally, but not seriously. But the power of this was that he was connecting with an audience in a way that was emotionally very powerful. And yet it didn't connect with elites who hadn't been to a wrestling match. And most importantly, they didn't even see how it was connecting with another group because they hadn't been to a wrestling match. So in a way, the whole experience was a sign of why it pays to think about performance, about ritual, about immersive experiences, and above all else, why it pays to think about what tribe you come from, social tribe. I'm using the word tribe very loosely, and what you're missing because you don't even realize how your own prejudices blinker you and essentially create tunnel vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that passage really blew me away. I mean, I'm American, and I have non-ironically been to entertainment wrestling matches, and I had not seen that at all. But once I read about it and what you wrote that other authors had written about it, it was like, oh yes, that's obviously the name calling and the taunting and the performance, but the sort of knowledge on the audience's part that it's for show. It's not real. We don't take it seriously. And I think that, yeah, that's such an interesting insight. And I think you had similar sorts of observations, especially around sort of silences and agreed upon understandings in your studies or in your coverage of the securities markets. So it seems like you began to hear some alarm bells prior to 2008 in your coverage of the financial securities markets, when you saw that bankers were entirely comfortable in this world where no one else understood their jargon or could make sense of what they were doing. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that experience and also share with us where you think, in what other settings do we see cultures like this where people are very insular and are using very particular jargon, that you feel concerned about now, where you see similar trends might be unfolding?
Absolutely. Well, just as my understanding of Donald Trump was very much informed by a gigantic ritualistic ceremony called the wrestling match, my understanding of finance was deeply informed by going to a large investment banking conference in 2005. And everyone on the call probably or watching it has been to kind of business industry conferences. And you go along and you think, yeah, very interesting, whatever. Well, in my training as an anthropologist in Tajikistan, I looked at marriage rituals. That was one of my main topics. And I used marriage rituals as a tool to understand the wider cultural patterns, because in marriage rituals, you basically assemble a scattered group, you reaffirm social ties, you essentially don't just recreate a social group, you also reflect and reinforce a shared worldview through rituals and symbols. And when I went to an investment banking conference in 2005, when I walked in, it occurred to me that actually investment banking conferences for the financial industry play exactly the same role as marriage rituals in Tajikistan, in the sense that your investment banking conferences unite a scattered tribe or scattered group, reaffirm social ties, and have a series of rituals and ceremonies and symbolic actions, which essentially reflect and reinforce a worldview. And when I looked at what was happening in the investment banking conference I went to in Nice in 2005, which was run by the credit derivatives and securitization world, it occurred to me there were several key features of what was going on. Firstly, you had very much a tribe, if you like, of securitization bankers who had a very strong sense of common identity. That was defined partly by the fact that they were in charge of they controlled a sort of jargon or language which no one else understood. A bit like the priests in medieval Catholic Church in Europe who spoke Latin and the congregation didn't. And it made the priests who spoke Latin feel elite and a sense of allegiance to each other. But also, they didn't expect anyone from outside their group to really be looking in or understand what they did. Again, the priest spoke Latin, no one else did. Why would anyone else want to uncover what was actually happening inside that world? They'd got used to this idea that they were set apart. The group also had a very strong creation myth. Any social group has a creation myth. It's usually designed to support the power of the elite. In this case, the strong creation myth was a myth of liquefaction, the idea that their innovations were brilliant and would be good for all of humanity because essentially they were making financial markets more liquid than ever and enabling risk to be dispersed. And that creation myth was riddled with intellectual contradictions, like the fact that the products they were creating were so darn complicated that they weren't actually traded, and you didn't actually have mark-to-market prices that were genuine market prices. They were often made up with models. So it was riddled with contradictions, but that's not unusual. Every single society has a creation myth that is always riddled with contradictions. But the problem is that if you are a tribal elite group that doesn't have outsiders looking in, you can't see those. So that was another issue. And the last point was that their creation myth implied that this was all about serving people. But when I looked at their PowerPoints, there wasn't a single face in any of their PowerPoints. And when I heard them talk, I realized that they had somehow in their mental map of finance taken the end user out of their vision of finance. And they were unable to see the end consequences or context of what they were doing and how it impacted on real people. And in fact, that was doubly illustrated by the fact that if any of you have watched the movie The Big Short, there's a wonderful scene where some of the people in the hedge fund go down to Florida and see a pole dancer who's taken out subprime mortgages, and they listen to her talk, and they have a kind of, wow moment when they realize that actually the end humans in this financial chain are acting differently from what they'd expected. And the thing that's shocking about that is not the fact they realize that, but the fact that so few people realize that because they weren't in contact with the end consequences of what they were doing. So I came back from the conference and was both fascinated by this activity, but also then became increasingly alarmed by the impact and the consequence of this tunnel vision. And if you then look at the other question of, where else is this playing out? Well, when I went to Silicon Valley in 2011, 2012, it struck me then that in fact, exactly the same patterns were developing in the tech sector in a really quite extreme way. And that helped to inform me to write pieces, saying that there is a techlash coming. There will be a backlash against the senior people in tech if they don't change, if they don't learn the lessons from finance, which turned out to be correct. I actually used a similar kind of mentality and model to write about the world of medicine and, ironically, epidemiology a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, actually, warning that once again you had a very geeky world. And there it wasn't so much a question of people deliberately trying to use their elite status to keep the rest of the world out. It was more the fact that the wider world had become accustomed to ignoring what was happening in epidemiology because it was seen as being geeky and very technically complex. And I should stress that part of the issue here isn't just the case that the geeks or whoever's in charge of a body of technical knowledge are shutting everyone out deliberately. It's also very much because the rest of society kind of assumes lazily that anything that's technical and geeky is boring and dull, and they don't want to see it. The other point I'd make is that, if you look at what's happening in cybersecurity today, or even in many of the areas of technology, which are actually, just about developing AI, or not just, but developing AI, again, I see that pattern occurring.
Mm.
And ironically, some of the people working in tech recognize that themselves and say that's dangerous too. Fascinating set of submissions from Alex Karp, the head of CEO of Palantir last summer, ahead of the IPO, who pointed out that, essentially society has outsourced most of the really difficult technical decisions or ethical decisions about AI to, as he says, a small group of coders sitting in a remote part of the country, i.e. Silicon Valley. And they don't necessarily want that responsibility. They're almost certainly not equipped to have it. And yet we let them do it.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the challenges baked into spotting these communities that have particular tunnel vision is that because they are so insular, as someone who's not a member of the community, it can be hard to get in and even see that, they're using all this jargon that no one else understands. And I think that's where, as a journalist, in some ways, you have some special access because you're often allowed to enter these spaces where regular people wouldn't necessarily be allowed. So if these were communities that had, lots of outsiders sort of flowing in and out, and there were lots of sort of free flow of ideas, they're less likely to have this tunnel vision. But because they have this tunnel vision, they're less likely to have people come in and sort of point it out to them. So it seems, particularly tricky in that sense. And, on that note, I wanted to bring up a question that has come in from Slido, and if anyone else is interested in posing questions, please feel free to go to Slido and do so. So Feriel points out that it can be very difficult to enter communities or spaces where we feel uncomfortable, and asks, do you have any advice on balancing seeking out other viewpoints with managing the stress that can be caused by seeing them? It can feel very overwhelming or upsetting.
Well, I think that's a fantastic question to ask because, you actually are quite right. We are not designed as humans in any way, shape, or form to embrace the weird or different or anything which challenges our worldview. That's just the reality. Any psychologist will tell you that. And I often think that when Donald Trump said, that Africa and Haiti were like, excuse my language, shitholes, his words, not mine. Everybody who had a conscience recoiled in horror and said, that's appalling, because it is appalling. And yet some tiny element of that is inside all of us, this idea of shunning things that seem weird and different and scorning them, because it is psychologically stressful. So what would I suggest? Well, first of all, aside from the obvious thing of having courage, is start small. Don't necessarily go and travel to Tajikistan first. Or if you're a liberal, don't go and put yourself amongst the Trumpists or vice versa. Just try talking to people who are at the end of your street or in the next door department to you with a different training and professional perspective or a different generation, and just try to openly listen and ask them what they think and how they see you, and listen. It can be really instructive. Recognize if you are involved in any type of education whatsoever, even just raising your own kids, the sooner you start teaching people that culture shock is a good thing and should be actually baked into some kind of syllabus or process of growing up, the better. recognize that actually you can do that to a certain degree, get some flavor of culture shock online if you can't travel. And that's a big issue right now. Going online, immersing yourself in different point of view in terms of, chat rooms, social media sites, et cetera, can be one way to do that. And then if that all else fails, tell yourself it's worth embracing culture shock for reasons of both fear and greed. Fear, because if you don't do that, if you don't actually flip the lens and ask other people to look at you and try and understand other worlds, you may end up missing some of the biggest risks out there that could hurt you. If Western leaders had basically spent a bit more time finding out where Wuhan was on the map and what was going on there, rather than just assuming it was kind of weird, actually COVID-19 would have never become so bad. Conversely, there's a greed principle. Actually looking at other worlds and different perspectives can deliver amazing insights that will make you more innovative, more creative, and spot opportunities. Tiny example, I tell the story in my book of Nestle and Kit Kat. And Nestle for years was selling this brown biscuit called Kit Kat, which was totally British. At the turn of the century, it noticed that for some reason they couldn't quite understand, sales in Japan in the southern island of Kyushu were surging between December and February each year. Couldn't understand it until they realized that a sort of subculture of teenagers in Japan had started treating Kit Kat as a good luck charm for exams, because kitoketsu in Japanese sounds like Kit Kat. And that's kind of really weird to Western eyes, and they could have very easily dismissed it, but they didn't. They actually lent into this weird behavior and started marketing Kit Kat as essentially a prayer tool for exam stress for teenagers in Japan. Sounds totally weird to people in America and Europe. Within a few years, 50% of Japanese teenagers were using Kit Kat as a prayer tool, good luck charm. I kid not. And it transformed chocolate sales. So as I say, if you find cultural shock scary, think fear and greed.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's sort of thinking about culture shock almost as a muscle that we need to develop, that we need to sort of practice in small incremental ways and get better at and work into sort of our, since we can't travel now, like our media diet and things like that, just to be exposed to positions that we find uncomfortable. And so I want to bring in just a couple more questions that have come up kind of along that same line of thought. So a couple of questioners have asked about the role of diversity and inclusion as relates to these ideas. So one audience member has asked, how would you apply your anthropology principles to diversity and inclusion issues? Another audience member, Cynthia, asks, do your principles support the idea that the best innovation and advancement come from multidisciplinary groups or teams? So what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, I agree. Yes. Basically, there is a growing body of evidence, particularly from the financial world, but not just from the financial world, showing that diverse teams outperform homogenous teams. And the reason is simply that having different points of view doesn't just allow you to see new opportunities and risks, it provides checks and balances. One of the best ways to get checks and balances in any system is to show whatever you've done, bounce your ideas off other people who are different from you, and to get that multi-perspective view. And yes, working with diverse teams can slow processes down. You can't make decisions quite as quickly and easily. It can be harder and slower to build trust. All of that is incredibly, fair points. And I'm not saying you need diverse teams for everything, but if you don't have a diversity of opinions in a group, how do you get that kind of checks and balances? That's the thing that everyone should be asking right now. And, to get diversity of opinions, you need to not just listen to different opinions, you need to try and get empathy for different opinions as well. And I'd stress that diversity doesn't just mean box-ticking racial diversity or gender diversity. It means different approaches to life and different thoughts, or dare I say it, different generations.
And how, in your work as a journalist, how have you seen newsrooms shift, sort of become more diverse spaces? And with that, have you seen sort of the stories that are covered or the way that they are covered change?
Well, there's contradictory trends happening in journalism right now. On the one hand, journalism has, realized how non-diverse it often is, and is making really serious attempts to rectify that. I mean, the Financial Times, we are hyper conscious of this. In terms of gender ratios, we have transformed ourselves completely in the last 20 years. When I joined, I was one of very few women in anything other than the most junior roles. And now, half of our senior leadership team is female.
Mm.
We have been very much slower to address the issue of racial diversity. We are trying extremely hard now, but that's been a very slower process. And I think we are absolutely recognize that bringing in more racial diversity is really, really, really important to get a wider range of sensibilities and stories. So that's something we're very committed to at the FT, and I know that many other media groups are as well. The flip side of that, though, is that we also work in a world where the media is often under great financial pressure. And great financial pressure always prompts organizations to streamline into efficient, focused operations. And efficient, focused operations are good in many ways, but they can also lead to tunnel vision and people operating in ghettos. So basically, you have this department that's got to do this thing in particular, and it's focused just on that and doesn't have the chance to roam and collide with the unexpected. And at the same time, we live in a media world that's very noisy, and where people feel the only way to get attention is to shout noisily and to shout to often a niche audience, because that's the easiest way to get attention from a sticky group in a reliable way. And those 2 points combined mean that often journalism today, media today, is in danger of falling into its own tribal patterns. It ends up looking at news and the world in quite a blinkered tunnel vision way. It ends up essentially talking to its own audience. It ends up basically with an internal structure which is subdivided into departments which reflect the tribal patterns in the world that it's actually covering. And by that, I mean that, insofar as techies don't talk to financiers, don't talk to lawyers, they're all in different groups. Journalists often create, sort of a tech team, a banking team, a legal team, and they may not talk to each other either. So those elements, I think, do, create diversity questions and questions about, holistic visions of the world and social silences for journalists too. And that's a big issue, both in terms of how they look at the world and interpret the world, and in terms of how they organize themselves, and in terms of how they communicate their messages to the wider world.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you write about in the book is that a lot of companies have started to open themselves up to different viewpoints by including teams of social scientists, by bringing in social scientists to their operations. And these collaborations can sometimes be quite damaging, as in the case of Cambridge Analytica, and they can sometimes be very helpful for organizations to sort of see things that they've been missing, as you write about in the case of General Motors. And so we have a question from an audience member regarding the tech world. There are many anthropologists and social scientists doing research in this industry, i.e. user research. Have you seen any impact of this? Would you mind talking about some of the examples that you write about in your book of sort of teams of social scientists collaborating with the business community?
Absolutely. Well, basically, thank you for the point. There are many anthropologists who have been hired by tech companies in the last 25, 30 years. In fact, I think Microsoft is technically one of the biggest employees of anthropologists in the world. They were initially brought in very much to do user research, and they have had an impact in varying degrees. Sometimes they've helped companies to change how they design their products. I tell the story in my book about Intel, and how it brought anthropologists in, who sometimes, but quite often didn't, had an impact on the design of things. For example, anthropologists went to look at cars and tech and IT and what it meant to turn vehicles into software on wheels. Until that point, the engineers had been looking at the question in terms of what is the software inside the car, and let's ask consumers what they think about the software inside the car. So defining it very much in a bounded way in terms of the car and the software, which sounds obvious because most of us are trained to think, well, if you're going to study software and cars, you're going to ask people about software and cars. What the anthropologist did was go and ask some car users to pull out every single thing in their car and put it out on a mat so they could see the social silence, what people weren't talking about. And most
I
of
love the image of this in the book of people being in this like parking garage and pulling out
it's
all
basically
of the stuff
a
from
parking
their
garage in Singapore.
cars.
There are, I mean, imagine if you had to do that. You had to pull out every single item in your car today, put it on a plastic mat, and someone stands up and photographs it. Well, your first reaction probably would be embarrassment and shame, because you know there's a whole bunch of things in your car that you kind of ignore and probably shouldn't be in your car, or you wish wasn't in your car. But then you have to ask, well, why is there embarrassment and shame? Rubbish and dirt is basically matter out of place. That's what it is, according to Mary Douglas, the anthropologist. And when you look down at the things on the plastic mat in a car, you realize that there's a whole bunch of stuff that you're ignoring, social silences. And in the case of these cars, they included, a bunch of things like personal electronic gadgets, your cell phone, your CD player. And what the anthropologists realized was when they actually watched how people drove their cars and used the cars with tech, often they used the inbuilt systems, but they often also used their own systems when they were stuck in traffic. They'd go onto their own cell phones or they'd play their own music on their CD players. And the anthropologists realized that actually what was happening is people still liked their own systems because it gave them a sense of security. So they went to the engineers and said, why don't you actually try to develop systems to sync up personal devices with the car, rather than assuming that they're going to use the tech inside the car, which you have so lovingly created. So that's one example where people have had impact. I should say there are plenty of examples where they haven't had impact, where essentially engineers have ignored the anthropologist's messages because often, those messages don't fit with the engineer's worldview. But so USX is one area where tech companies can use anthropologists. Second area, though, where they are just beginning to think about it, but it's still very early stage, is thinking about the wider ethical implications of the tech they're developing. Isn't done nearly enough, but there is a discussion going on right now in the AI sphere, for example, about how to use anthropologists to look at the social context of tech for ethical and regulatory reasons. And the area where tech companies haven't yet used anthropologists, but absolutely should, is in terms of flipping the lens and looking back at themselves and seeing how their own tribal patterns shape how they imagine tech, for reasons that are sometimes good, but more often very bad.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we actually just got another question in about sort of turning the lens back on ourselves. So we have an audience member who has actually asked a question sort of for anthropologists. And as a sociologist, I would say for, sociologists as well, because I think we're in the same category. And this audience member asks, do you have a message for anthropologists about how the discipline might better engage with business or policy making? And I imagine that part of the answer to that question relates to sort of the tribal nature of anthropology, and how anthropologists see themselves as a group.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ironies is that anthropologists are beset by all kinds of tribal patterns and handicaps that they themselves often haven't recognized. And that really tragically has undermined efforts to get anthropology into mainstream policy making. I think it's tragic that, people use other branches of social science like, economics, history, psychology, I'd even say sociology, a lot more than anthropology. And that's not just the fault of the outside world. In fact, it's mostly not the fault of the outside world, or the Indiana Jones stereotype. A lot of it's down to issues that anthropologists need to recognize. One, the discipline has often been very purist, a bit of a guild, in the sense that it only really appreciates academic anthropologists. It often is very suspicious of even other academic departments. It's often been suspicious of working with other disciplines in the past. And it's also handicapped by two other things that are pretty unique to anthropology. One is that the skill set you need to be a brilliant anthropologist or ethnographer involves being willing to humbly and patiently take yourself out of the picture and observe others. And that makes for really interesting people. It makes for people who are disastrously bad at hustling to promote their ideas on the public platform. Because essentially you have to hustle and put yourself in the spotlight often to actually be heard. Many anthropologists would see me as a bit of a sellout because of what I do. Anthropologists also tend to be instinctively pretty anti-establishment and very cynical or opposed to power structures and money. Because, when you've actually tried to deconstruct the world and look at it through a kind of critical lens, it's very hard to have many illusions left about power or money and to want to be part of the system. And that's, another handicap. And the other issue is anthropology. Part of the brilliant power of anthropology is that it looks at life in all its subtleties and shades of grey, which is actually a very accurate way to look at life. But it means that if you're operating in a world where everyone expects ideas to be transmitted on PowerPoints in short slogans or elevator pitches, that makes anthropologists, recoil in horror. But without that, you can't communicate. So if you are an anthropologist who's wondering, how do I get more involved? I would say, one, appreciate that there are great ideas happening outside the academic world. It's not the same. It's often anthropology light, but don't just devalue it. Recognize the incredible value of working with other disciplines. Anthropology plus medicine creates amazing medical anthropology. Anthropology plus computer science is absolutely what we need in the future. Recognize that going into the real world involves compromises, big compromises. You may not be willing to make those, and I totally respect that if that's the case. Some people think that working for a big company is like working for the Victorian Empire and is simply morally reprehensible. I respect that. But then recognize that unless you get involved inside systems, you probably aren't going to be in a position to change them if that's what you want to do. And then think about communication styles. Think about how to boil your ideas down into short, sharp, snappy points. Recognize, again, there are compromises. And then also, this is a really practical thing, recognize the value of using these incredible platforms that have sprung up recently, like The Conversation, amazing website that highlights academic work, like Sapiens, like podcasts, to get these ideas out into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. But, the reality is that doing work with business or with policymakers involves compromises. And it's really up to you to decide whether or not you want to make those compromises or not. In my case, I have. I personally think it's worth it. Realize other people may not. But unless we get more anthropologists into these spheres, it will be very hard to get this unique mindset more widely disseminated.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one of the things that you write about is the way that anthropologists and other social scientists have helped us understand the pandemic and the processes unfolding from the pandemic. So I wanted to ask you a few questions about that. There are a few that have come up in the chat and that emerged for me as I was reading your book. So, in your dissertation fieldwork that you discussed at the outset of our conversation, you found that members of this Tajik community were blending Islamic values and communist values by enacting communist morals in the public space when they were, sort of outside of their homes, and then Islamic values when they were in their private home space. And, I think we have similar public-private logics of sociability and morality in the West. And I also think, one thing that a lot of people have observed is that during the pandemic, these public and private spaces have collided, have blended, sometimes in ways that feel great and sometimes in ways that feel inappropriate. And so I wanted to ask, sort of based on your anthropological training, how do you see that public-private division shifting as we inevitably continue to have some large fraction of our lives taking place digitally in the future?
I think that is such a fascinating question. And one of the reasons I love, one of the reasons that I, think that actually the messages in my book are very relevant today, is that, I talk all about the value of embracing some culture shock. We've all undergone culture shock in the last year and a half, whether or not we wanted to, because actually being tossed from our offices back home, if we're working in offices or public spaces, to live in the private space has been a dramatic culture shock. And actually, oddly enough, going back into public space and offices or anything else, we're lucky enough to be returning to them, is another culture shock all over again. So none of us are taking for granted anymore the rituals and routines and spatial patterns that we used to take for granted. And I think what the experience has made many people think about, how they want to structure their lives and time, how they want to, organize their space, what kind of work they want, how they present a public face and a private face, all of that, because of course that's all collided in the last year. I think going forward, anyone who is, in a professional capacity or running other people needs to very consciously address this and think about this very clearly. And it's not just about, thinking, do we want staff in 3 days a week in the office or not? How do we manage a sort of hybrid culture where some people are in staff or not in the office? Because those are really important questions that people do need to think about. They need to think about questions about how teams actually operate in offices as opposed to online. I talk a lot about this, the value of what anthropologists call sense making, this idea that we absorb information as groups and make decisions, not just through verbal cues or rational processes that we think we use, but also through all of this kind of informal, unstated, non-verbal patterns of communication and information gathering, which happens in offices. We need to think about incidental information exchange, that actually the real value of an office is not the fact that tiny groups of people talk to each other, because if you have a tiny team with high level of social capital, you can replicate that quite easily in cyberspace. It's the fact that big offices enable the teams to collide with each other and you get ideas swapped between teams, which is actually crucial for the fertilization of ideas in a group.
So these are, just to jump in, this incidental information exchange is like the spontaneous encounter you might have with someone at the coffee maker or the water cooler, where you share information or they share information that you didn't even know you needed.
Absolutely. That's incidental information exchange. It's all about serendipity. So, we need to think about those kind of things as we go from what's been private space into public space. And then think again about, are there elements of the last year we want to retain? And I don't just mean this idea that we don't all have to commute for hours each day, but I'm very struck that on a Zoom call, everyone is equal in the face of a computer screen. Normally, when you have a physical meeting, the leader dominates. And in many offices, that's the male dominant leader who physically dominates the room. And everyone else kind of sits around the edge and through nonverbal cues realizes they can't speak. If you're on a Zoom call, then yes, that can happen. But also, if you have a system where people raise their hands if they want to speak or just wave at the screen, there's often more equality and there's more geographical equality as well. So those are interesting issues about how you can actually learn from some of the lessons of the last year and maybe put them to use going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I was most struck by in the spring of 2020, I had been teaching in person, and then the courses went online sort of very unexpectedly. And in a large course that I had, once we went online, I had students who I had never heard from when we were meeting in person, who all of a sudden were very active participating in Zoom classes. And that just really highlighted to me the way that this medium allows certain people who might be shy or uncomfortable speaking in person to really flourish. So I think you're right that there are elements of this that we certainly want to retain going forward. And sort of, I guess related to that point, we have a question from the audience about departmental silos, which was something you were just referring to. This audience member writes, many companies are aware of departmental silos and struggle to surpass this. Have you seen any ways from anthropology that have helped to alleviate this challenge?
I think there are masses of ways that anthropology should help alleviate this challenge by simply enabling managers to flip the lens and see the silos and see how damaging they can be,
Mm-hmm.
but flip the lens and realize how we're all shaped by our own assumptions. And also, frankly, to think about rituals and ceremonies and symbols that might actually break them down. For the most part, they haven't used anthropologists to do this. Some companies have done this anyway. Ironically, although Facebook is beset by a sort of, silo problem or tunnel vision problem across the tech sector as a whole, inside a company like Facebook, they've done quite a remarkable job of trying to break these down. And I tell that story in my last book, The Silo Effect. But one case I do talk about where a company has brought in an anthropologist to look at their own processes, for at least for a period of time, is General Motors. Because General Motors actually employed an anthropologist in the 1980s to study how it worked or how it didn't work. And she did amazing work on things like realizing that, the union problems in the 1980s were the symptoms of a cause, not the cause of the issues itself. But also she did some fascinating work with an attempt that General Motors made to bring together a German team from Rüsselsheim, a team from Tennessee, and a team from Detroit to build collectively a small car. It went disastrously badly wrong. They couldn't understand why. They thought initially it was because of an engineering clash or an ethnic clash between the Germans and the Americans. And that was part of it. But the real problem was that they had three different factory groups trying to work together, and all three had different cultural assumptions, including a split between the two different groups of Americans from Tennessee and Detroit. And one of the areas it manifested itself is in their assumptions around the word meeting. We all think that we know what a meeting is. It's universal. Meetings happen everywhere. We're probably all about to go back into in-person meetings. And one of the huge problems was that we never talk about what we think a meeting is. It's one of those areas of social silence. It turned out that they all had different assumptions. And some people think that a meeting is work. That's where you get work done. Some people think that a meeting isn't work. You do the work first, and then you have the meeting to basically rubber stamp, or it's just a ritual to finish off the work. Some people think a meeting is a ritual to start the work. Some people think a meeting is basically for, an egalitarian exchange of views, and everyone basically, brainstorms. Some people think a meeting is basically about a leader imposing their will on everyone else and demonstrating how powerful they are by having essentially a hierarchical pattern. And none of those assumptions are necessarily wrong, but they're different. And to really come to the key message of my book, if you don't think about those differences, recognize they exist, recognize they always exist as a spectrum. They're not boxes, they're a spectrum, but they are different. If you don't think about that, you will trip up. Conversely, if you recognize that culture matters, you may get insights that can help you navigate the world better in business, finance, policy making, and much else.
Well, thank you so much for that, Gillian. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but this was a delightful conversation. And thank you to the audience members as well for being so engaged and sending us so many questions. I apologize that I couldn't get to all of them. I will now hand the baton off to Rod.
Thank you, Laura and Gillian. That was absolutely fascinating, and really so much covered in that struck me personally, and I'm sure many of our our audience members. And to me, something just to sort of pull out was something you discussed early in the conversation about the sometimes disconnect between the kinds of purposes that folks say that they're doing their work towards, whether that was among financiers or one can imagine politicians, and then how that can become disconnected from what actually happens, and that's perhaps a red flag for us to pay attention to. And certainly in the work that we do at the Legion Institute, this is something we follow closely, is how businesses are increasingly positioning their work in terms of some sort of greater purpose than just making money. And so maybe that's as much a warning sign as it is potentially a good thing, and something for us to be considering. Before we depart, let me tell you about all of our events. As you may know, we are constantly running fantastic events on a whole range of issues in the business world and beyond, and this is such a great example of that. We will have an event coming up on Wednesday, June 23rd from 5 to 6 p.m. in which a panel of experts will present and discuss reopening the Canadian economy safely post-COVID, and as we wind that down, and how companies and organizations can set up rapid screening systems in their workplaces to keep employees and customers safe. So please join us for that or for other events of this kind. Full details and to register are on the Rotman Events website. Until then, thanks again to Laura and Gillian, and have a great day, and we hope to see you again at another session. Thanks so much for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you to Laura.
And Laura, and to the events team for pulling it together.
Thank you, everyone.